Welcome, everyone. As you enter into the webinar, we welcome you to place your name, your institution, and your role in the chat so we can see who's here. Be sure to select the drop-down menu for all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see who is here in the room with us. And we'll start in a few moments. Welcome, everyone. We invite you to enter your name, your institution, and your role in the chat. And be sure to select all panelists and attendees in the chat to area. And we'll start in a few moments. We'll give it another minute to welcome everyone, adding your name, your institution, and the role that you play in the chat area. We've got most registrants on their way. And be sure to select all panelists and attendees when you're entering information in the chat area. And that's available as the blue drop-down menu next to the 2 colon at the bottom of the chat. Okay, we're going to get started today. Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Adams. I'm the instructional designer at Achieving the Dream, and we'll be supporting the technical and the chat and the Q&A today for today's webinar on our in-network forum on equitable access and outcomes in a post-COVID environment. Again, we welcome you to enter your name, your institution, and your role in the chat area, being sure to select all panelists and attendees in the chat box. Other technical reminders for today include the Q&A box. So we will be having a variety of Q&A opportunities and would like to track those questions. So feel free to enter questions throughout the presentation today by selecting the Q&A box or the button at the bottom, and a box will show up. We also have live closed captioning today. So if you'll notice a closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. You select that and then select Show Subtitle. And again, the chat area is also seen here, where you can enter information in the chat or comments, but we recommend for any questions that you use the Q&A box. Let me just see here. All right. So I'm now going to introduce our moderator, Monica Parrish-Trent, who's our Vice President of Network Engagement. Take it away, Monica.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to see so many of you here for today's in-network forum, Equitable Access and Outcomes in a Post-COVID Environment. Joining me today are Dr. Karen Stout, President and CEO of Achieving the Dream, Dr. Sumun Pendakur, Chief Learning Officer and Director of USC Equity Institutes at USC Race and Equity Center, Susan Mayer, Achieving the Dream's Chief Learning Officer, Jonathan Lanzini, Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream, Shauna Davis, Executive Director of Holistic Student Supports at Achieving the Dream, Dr. Mark Figueroa, Associate Provost for Institutional Research and Planning and Assistant Professor at the Graduate School of Education, Lewis and Clark College, and ATD Data and Equity Coach, Vicki Locke, Dean of Student Success Northeast Wisconsin Technical College and ATD leadership coach. Dr. Stout will begin today with sharing some opening remarks. Dr. Stout.
Thank you, Monica, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today from all across the country. It was great to see you log into the chat function, and I see we have faculty, staff, presidents, administrators, and some of our Achieving the Dream coaches joining us this afternoon. Last week, Achieving the Dream held a webinar to facilitate sharing among our network presidents. And really, we were focusing on how our colleges are responding to COVID and the challenges that COVID is presenting primarily for our students. I shared some initial thoughts to frame the conversation with the presidents, including a poem from Janet Kelvin. And the poem goes like this: "You have set sail on another ocean without star or compass, going where argument leads, shattering the certainties of centuries." I also reflected on the words of James Fallows, who was our keynote speaker at Dream in February. Many of you heard James Fallows, who said that after visiting many of our colleges and communities, that he found that the people on the ground at our community colleges are, quote unquote, the people working the hardest towards solutions, at least in my experience, though they are disproportionately represented at America's community colleges. He also said that America's community colleges are the institutions of this moment. And he certainly was right in February, and he's right now as well. And at the time, I was making the case to the presidents that while COVID has caused us to indeed set sail on an unknown sea, we are not without star or compass. And I suggested that our localness, our understanding of what our communities as well as our students need, could not be attacked by COVID, and that localness was a powerful lever to use as we face the challenges ahead of us. And as I continue to reflect on those words and the stories that our colleges are sharing, I would add that ATD's longstanding commitment to equity and excellence give us a star and a compass during COVID, as well as the time, hopefully, when we will be beyond COVID, but certainly will be changed. I was struck last week by the stories of the presidents. One theme that ran through the presentations was that the work that the institutions had taken on with Achieving the Dream under the work of student success, especially in building fundamentals, the 7 capacities that we think are essential for a student-focused culture, that work had positioned the colleges to make quick pivots and to adjust to new realities, while also keeping a mindful eye on the impact that their moves had on student equity and equitable outcomes. One president in particular spoke about how her institution decided to call every student who received emergency aid or who dropped a course to see what the college could do to support the students and get them back into class. The college has kept good data on these calls, and then they've disaggregated the data to see where students are. Most of these students were from marginalized populations that had long been on the college's equity radar screen, which confirmed for the college that they had to continue keeping their eye on the issues of equity, most importantly now during these chaotic times of COVID. At almost every campus, COVID has made more visible the inequities of our structures and systems on our campuses. I suspect by now you've heard many stories about colleges that set up hotspots in their parking lots or in the community at public libraries that gave out emergency and customized care kits or connected students to various community support services. They also raised funds to support emergency financial aid. What's really important about this financial aid is that it's financial aid that helps students who are not covered by CARES Act funding. Students, and the CARES Act covers students that fall under Title IV qualification. Many of our students are left out based on the way CARES Act dollars came to our colleges. And they've adopted any number of strategies for supporting highly vulnerable students. While all these things are good and they help us keep our eye on equity, there really do remain questions about how long our colleges can sustain the energy and the commitment needed to help us see through the COVID pandemic, unless we take some time to learn from our rapid response and then backfill with strategies that help us scale the new processes and systems in ways that will sustain their strength. I'm encouraged by the numbers of faculty and staff who are registered for this webinar. It shows how seriously you take the long-term work that we have committed to as an Achieving the Dream network around student success. And I'm especially pleased that we have an opportunity today and in the coming months to work in partnership with the University of Southern California Race and Equity Center so that we can continue to go deeper in our equity work. I'm reminded this morning, our partners at the American Council on Education released some important leadership principles that I think guide us forward. And one of their calls is something that has long been in the tradition of Achieving the Dream, but the call is this: to apply a student-centric, safety-first, and equity-minded lens while emphasizing financial sustainability from conceptualization through implementation. And this includes putting diversity, equity, and inclusion front of mind and being aware of how decisions impact underrepresented and marginalized communities. Our ATD colleges have a habit of putting equity in the center of their work. And I'm really looking forward today to exploring with you and learning with you more about that, what that work looks like on the ground. Like you, I'm remote and working from home. And while I was offering these opening remarks, I have two animals that are seeking my attention. So I apologize if I seemed a little bit distracted. But it's great to have everybody on the webinar today, and I look forward to tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Before we hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Pendakur, we'll begin with a poll. Please take a moment to answer this question. Which of these areas is giving you most cause for concern as you head towards the next fiscal year? Distance learning, academic engagement, co-curricular engagement, faculty and staff mental health. We're hearing from one panelist, how about all of the above? Yes, all of the above. But let us know which one has the most concern for you right at this moment. We'll probably take another 15, 20 seconds for you to respond. So here are responses. 78% of you said at this moment, distance learning, academic and engagement. 78% co-curricular engagement, 6%, and faculty and staff mental health, 16%. Thank you. Dr. Sumun Pendakur is the Chief Learning Officer and Director of USC Equity Institutes at the USC Race and Equity Center, which is a partner with ATD's upcoming Racial Equity Leadership Academy that Dr. spoke about. Prior to serving in this role, she was the Assistant Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Harvey Mudd College and as the Director for USC Asian Pacific American Student Services. She is a scholar practitioner whose research focuses on critical race theory, Asian American and Pacific Islander students, change agents, and institutional transformation. Sumi was recently appointed to the Board of Directors for the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. She is the co-editor with Dr. Sean Harper and Dr. Stephen Quay of Student Engagement in Higher Education, Theoretical Perspectives and Practical Approaches for Diverse Populations, 3rd edition. Thank you, Sumi, for being here today.
It's an absolute pleasure. Can you hear me okay, Monica?
I can.
Okay, fantastic. It is so good to be here with over 200 colleagues from across the nation who are in the ATD network. Thank you for inviting me into this space today to be part of this conversation, which of course is never just one conversation. Those of us who are involved in this work are having these conversations on a daily and an hourly basis on so many levels. And in the short time that I have with you today, I wanted to offer gratitude, number one, for every single person who is doing this work on behalf of our students across the country, oftentimes in some incredibly difficult circumstances, whether you are caretaking for older relatives or ill relatives, whether you have small ones at home. I personally am a mom of a 17-month-old and a 7-year-old. So just a shout out to all the parents out there. Between the sleep deprivation and attempting distance learning myself while juggling work, this has not been easy. So I just wanted to offer gratitude for all of you today and what you're doing and who you are. The few minutes that I have with you, I want to focus as broadly framing some of the thoughts that will flow forward in the next hour plus that we all have together. You're going to be hearing some from outstanding speakers who are doing some really incredible nuanced work in their individual locations today. So I thought I would offer some framing thoughts for that. Karen mentioned this, of course, that the spotlight that's being shined by COVID is a spotlight like no other in terms of how it has magnified and very clearly demonstrated the extant and existing gaps that already are very, very clear for all of us doing this work, and yet have not been clear for so many of our partners, for so many decision makers, in terms of who is most critically impacted in moments of crisis like this. So I want to start off by saying, that poll question about what are folks concerned about as we head towards the next fiscal year. And I saw, of course, that 78% of the respondents said that they're most concerned about distance learning, online education, faculty ramping up in these particular modalities. And before we even start to address that, I want to say that budgets cannot determine our commitment to equity-mindedness. That now more than ever, even in the context of belt tightening, cuts, I was just hearing that we may get a 20% cut to the education budget here in the state of California. The cuts are going to be brutal. And the cuts, of course, are coming after a 35 to 40 year divestment in the public good of higher education that has occurred through the neoliberal turn of this country, right? So we're setting this particular moment against a much larger socio-historical and economic trajectory that our country has been on. And yet now more than ever, with the demographic shifts we are experiencing, with the gaps that exist, more than ever is the time to double down on equity-mindedness as a key framework as the way we approach this work. So I wanted to offer just a few thoughts in our time today. So one, let's talk about the particular areas in which we need to be able to concentrate some attention. And I know many of you are already doing this work, so take what you want out of what I have to offer. First and foremost, in terms of classroom and distance learning, the technologies, we of course heard, for example, that Zoom went from something like 10 million users to 100 million users over the space of a month. I mean, just dramatic growth, exponential growth in the use of certain forms of technology for learning. And the platforms are barely catching up to what people actually need and how they're using them. So this is the time for us to be incredibly creative with the teams on our campuses, both the faculty and staff teams, but in particular, how do we bring in the folks in IT and in IT services to be equity-minded partners with us? Now, one interesting facet, of course, of so many of our campuses is that we end up very often siloed. So this person has this expertise, this person knows the most about LGBTQ students, this person knows the most about first-gen students, and very often, particularly when we look at our IT services, that is not where that expertise lies. It's a time to bring them into the fold. This is not an insult against all IT folks, some of whom I've worked with in the past, particularly at MUD, who have been outstanding. But this is a time to bring them into the fold to ensure that decisions that are made going forward about laying out pathways for IT, because this is not This is not a now concern. This is going to affect our industry, higher education, for the next 2 years at a minimum. So bringing them in to be partners with us and equipping everyone with this particular lens around equity-mindedness, dealing with racial and economic realities, and dealing with the fact that this is impacting people on different levels. That's number one that I'd offer. The second piece, of course, is that because this is a long-term strategy, that our faculty, and I saw that there's many faculty participating today, some of whom who are feeling well-equipped and some of whom feel like they're scrambling. It is not enough to do shift on the LMS. It's not enough to simply offer training on Zoom, but how do our faculty critically and compassionately engage students inclusively through pedagogical strategies, through all the ways they can through the distance learning platform, while also acknowledging the realities of how students have differing access to technology. So we are having, of course, conversations across the country about asynchronous and synchronous teaching and what's the value and what's the nature of intellectual property. And all of this is happening at the same time that huge proportions of our students are not able to access their education. So this is a real conundrum for all of us. So I would say equipping our faculty, not just with the technical skills, but the online pedagogy skills to continue to be inclusive teachers of our increasingly diverse democracy. Number two in this arena, co-curricular engagement. I saw that there are a number of folks in diversity units as well as student affairs who've signed on today. So co-curricular engagement, student success, increasing mental health resources, I would say are some of the most critical arenas going forward as budgetary decisions come down the pipeline. How do we advocate for the continuation or the expansion of these resources in a time like this? When I say co-curricular, I mean the engagement piece is still critical. Community colleges or four-year institutions, having multiple touch points for people to feel like they're not drifting off into space. That's been one of the hardest parts about this time for so many of us, is the feeling of distance and gap, and the feeling of being disconnected from the material reality of our campuses. So finding for new forms of co-curricular engagement, evolving forms of co-curricular engagement, which many of my student affairs colleagues all across the country are already doing, but also tying that again to the student success and retention outcomes and to mental health, which is the fastest growing concern of particularly our Gen Z students across the nation. Now, Gen Z students are not the only students in community colleges, but the collective national trauma that we are enduring right now in this time of COVID will need to be addressed going forward. So securing additional mental health resources moving forward. And then finally, in this particular bucket of my remarks, resourcing the faculty and staff who are doing the work. There are faculty and staff who are carrying inequitable and uneven loads on how the work is actually occurring, the thought work and the actual labor that is occurring on our campuses. And that's both frontline as well as faculty, as well as service, et cetera, all different kinds of staff and faculty. But when I say this, I feel that heading into this second point I want to bring up, in addition to all the different arenas we need to be able to tackle, we also have to look at this as a very critical opportunity. What is the opportunity to reimagine how we do the work in this moment rather than pretending it's business as usual? So like you, I'm talking to my friends and colleagues across the country, some of whom are saying, yeah, my campus is, of course, in the churn and burn of COVID decision-making, but is also forcing people to do business as usual, 6 or 8 hours of Zoom meetings a day, none of which, by the way, is sustainable. And so any of you who are listening in right now, there is a particular form of fatigue and exhaustion that sets in with this type of engagement, and we need to acknowledge that. So when I say reimagine how we do the work, what are more compassionate ways we have of doing the work in creating work-life cultures and balances that actually sustain people in the long term? We have a chance to reimagine and fix some of the extant problems that we already have. Our system is designed to, on some levels, use people. And those of us who work in higher education often love the work so much that we don't even realize then when we're getting burnt out. And I would love to see, I'll be following up on the chat in a few moments, but I would love to see how many of you are dealing with feelings of burnout or anxiety or anything like that at this moment. I know I certainly am struggling with those feelings, and I think many of us are. So taking these core buckets that our campuses need to be focusing on to, again, highlight that budgets cannot determine equity-minded paths forward, that we need to bring in new folks into the fold to the ways of doing business, and then how we need to use this an opportunity to not do business as usual. And every one of us in our arena, however small or however big that might be, has this chance to think through, how will I work with this? If you are a chair or a department head, how am I going to coach my faculty on this? If you are a dean or a vice president, what are the ways I'm resourcing the mental health and self-care needs of my staff at this time? Now, this is a lot, of course, because we're all juggling so many different things, but in the short time they gave me, I thought, let me throw out a lot so we have more to consider. Now, in moving from this idea of opportunity, I want to talk about specificity. So often our campuses, even the ones who are progressive and equity-minded, end up using sort of lumpen ways of treating people. We are going to treat all first-gen students this way. We are going to treat all low-income students this way. When I talk about opportunities, this also provides an opportunity to delve into some specificity of how different communities are experiencing COVID and its aftermath. DACA and undocumented students, parenting students, Black students, Latinx, Latina and Latino students, Native and Indigenous students, Asian and Asian American students, low-income students, international students. This is an opportunity to disaggregate that data, to connect with students. Karen gave this great example, and there have been a number of campuses across the country where provosts and other decision makers have said, we're gonna set up calling trees and we're gonna call students and find out how they're doing. This is critically important because the impact of COVID is not hitting all communities in the same way. Is it hitting many communities in similar ways? Yes, but to be able to delve down and see in what ways are Black and Latinx communities and Native communities who are dealing with the disproportionate levels of death and harm out of this moment, also dealing with the cross-section around income and access to resource issues, which then also sets up a cross-section, for example, with Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students. You have opportunities to both build and also better resource in some critically unique and targeted ways to communities that don't often get as much attention as they should. And it's also in that naming of the specificity that our campuses actually do a more compassionate job of dealing with the reality of their students. You, like me, have probably been looking at statements that campuses have been coming out with. And I've seen a variety of statements like, we're all in this together, this is a shared sacrifice. And I would gently push back on that by saying, no, we're not all in this together. This is not a shared sacrifice because it's being borne by different individuals and different communities differently. And we need to be able to name that because in those inequities lie additional gaps that create further harm amongst communities that are already experiencing minoritization and marginalization. I want to mention, of course, that in this time of opportunity and push and learning, that there are some phenomenal resources that have been developed by colleagues all across the country just in the last few weeks alone. And those of you who are interested in this can certainly Google these, or I can send an email to Monica to be shared with the network. But Frank Harris and J. Luke Wood, coming out of San Diego State, have run a series of seminars targeting community college participants, faculty, staff, and students. Dr. Estela Ben-Simon out of the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California is leading a series of workshops right now that is available for folks. All of these are available also in terms of recordings. Dr. Sean Harper and Dr. Tyrone Howard just led a national discussion last week on the state of this experience, particularly focused on Black students. And my colleague Jade Agua and I at the USC Race and Equity Center a few weeks ago offered a workshop on Zoom bombing. So not only how do you actually reduce how Zoom bombing is occurring, but how do you deal with the harm that is created through those incidents and name it for what it is, right? Racist, sexist, xenophobic, whatever it might be, and then to create healing from that. We're also offering a seminar on the 28th, ways to support Asian and Asian American students during this time of heightened violence and anti-Asian racism. My point is of course that there's numerous resources available. Our time is all stretched and we all feel pulled in multiple directions. When there is a moment to invest in what's something I don't know, what are additional resources I could pull to equip my faculty and my staff and my students in more cogent and coherent ways, this is the time to do that as well. And then I'll close with one thought before we head into some Q&A, which is around self-care. And I cannot reiterate this enough. The folks who have tuned in today, there's 200 plus folks on this webinar today. You're the folks who care, who are doing, who are invested, and who are probably deeply taxed right now. And so finding every possible way, both on the individual level, which, by the way, again, as a working mom with a working spouse and 2 little ones, is very difficult for me to find personally. So I'm not telling you this because I'm great at it. I'm telling you because I know that our bodies and our minds need ways to find self-care, whatever that means for you as an individual, so that we don't collapse internally in this time of stress and crisis, and that we continue to push our institutions, always push our institutions to build in the structures of support so that we are not isolated and that we are not stretched to breaking points economically, spiritually, psychologically, etc. So those are some 5 key points that I wanted to raise today. Again, in this sort of broad framing, there's so many more places we could go with this, but I know that Monica has a couple questions for me, and then we can take it from there.
Thank you so much, Sumi. We are getting some questions in the Q&A, and there were also some questions that came in as part of the registration process. So one question that came in from one of our participants, Krista, she wants to know, can you give us better statements to share so we can guide others? Instead of saying we're all in this together, what might be a better response?
Oh, great question. Well, 2 thoughts about that. You know, so I'm on the board of directors for NADAHE, the National Association of Diversity Officers, Chief Diversity Officers, and we were recently having a conversation about that in one of our webinars. And I think that a couple of useful strategies around that are, one, always to take it back to the mission of the particular institution. So what is drawn from the mission that speaks to this particular moment, and so that there's always a tie through around what the campus says that it values and what it's actually doing in this moment to demonstrate those values, number 1. Number 2, I would offer that the opportunity to name that this is hitting communities differently is actually a really powerful form of leadership role modeling. For when messages come from the top, and we know this, right? We have thousands of negative messages coming from the very top of this country. Words like Chinese virus that then spark xenophobia, hatred, anti-Asian violence, etc. On the flip side, when our institutional leaders frame their responses as naming that people are experiencing this differently, you don't necessarily have to name specific communities, but acknowledging that this is landing differently. I think statements that also embed what is concretely being done to address the inequities and the gaps are really powerful, because then it's what are we doing, not just what are we saying. So I think the constant tie through of mission, values, concrete actions, and then naming that this is landing inequitably and differently. That's why I really push against campuses that use the language of family, because family in the best sense means that we care for those who are vulnerable. Family in the worst sense means that we take advantage and that we have abusive relationships. So I would push to say, what type of family are you really talking about? Great question, thank you.
Thank you, Sumi. So you talked about how people experience the COVID-19 and implications of the COVID-19 differently based on where they are in society and the circumstances that they deal with.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came in during the registration is, how can we center equity in meaningful ways without leveraging equity against marginalized communities?
Excellent question also. So let's go back to the core. You know, I know that Achieving the Dream and everyone in your network focuses heavily on equity and equity mindedness. Let's go back to the core of what equity mindedness is, right? Equity mindedness, coming directly out of Dr. Estela Ben-Simon's work and a number of other scholars, shifts the thinking away from blame and deficit to what is in our individual capacity and in our institution's capacity to say, if there is a gap, how do we not put blame on those where the gap is, but rather look at what is our institution's responsibility to meet people where they are, to build the appropriate scaffolds and supports, because one of the most powerful forms of equity mindedness is the outcomes focus, right? This is where the language of equal opportunity fails us, because equal opportunity, first of all, is predicated on a false level playing field, as if you can give everyone that same level playing field when it doesn't exist. And so focusing on what do we do inside our institutions to the best of our capacities, whatever those limitations might be, to build the scaffold and supports to get people to equitable outcomes, whether that is retention, year-to-year progress, moving out of resource math into more advanced math, whatever the benchmarks might be in your individual institution. I think secondly, right, in addition to taking the cognitive and moral framework of equity-mindedness, pairing that with what does it mean to teach data interpretation using asset-minded lenses, right? That every single person on a campus who is going to interact, whether they are staff or faculty or others, with students should be coached and trained on how to interpret data, because data unto itself can tell a variety of stories. And you know this, Monica, and all of our colleagues in the country. You can sit with people and you can look at a set of data and I can tell you a story and you can tell me a completely different story. And your interpretation, for example, could be completely racist and classist. So the training necessary to actually take data and to be able to tell an equity-minded story around that. What are the assets that people are bringing in? How can those be leveraged? What does success modeling look like? Where are the gaps in the institution? So for example, I was talking with a colleague just yesterday who was saying that the advising and course sequencing in his institution is so problematic that they have students, particularly first-gen Black students, in resource math at the same time they're in accounting 1. That's a setup for failure. So what this also offers us is an opportunity, rather than, again, using deficit-minded explanations for why people are experiencing gaps and harm differently, to say, what are the pathways in our environment? How are those developed in equity-minded ways? Are the pathways clear? Do they make sense for all communities? And then finally, this final piece about outcomes, our communities are experiencing the existing equity gaps and the magnified equity gaps in different ways. To continuously be able to focus on outcomes that we are trying to get all folks to be able to achieve to the highest of their possible level, that's the beauty of the equity-minded framework, requires our institutions to constantly be doing self-reflection work. That self-reflection, without that, we don't have anything. That core asset for ourselves of cultural humility versus cultural competence, I would throw it as a last skill when trying to address this. How do we meet needs without also falling into deficit-minded frameworks? Is that a fair response? And folks, feel free to chime in on the chat and tell me if I failed you.
Thank you, Sumi. We just had another question come in from Norma Hernandez. What role should accreditation agencies play to ensure that higher ed leaders have such skills as being able to understand data, engage in self-reflection work, and connect that to equity? Right.
To be honest, I think your question is an answer unto itself. What was the individual's name who asked the question?
Norma Hernandez.
Norma, thank you so much, Norma. This is, I think, a really rich opportunity and time. Again, I go back to this point about opportunity because in the moments where my mind spins out, I go into some pretty dark and devastating places about the future of higher education. So I'm going to bring this back to opportunity. What does this look like for accrediting bodies to cement the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as core outcomes, not just as nice things to have? And of course, accrediting bodies have moved fairly dramatically in the last 15 years on those questions. But then we need to be able to actually tie them to what's occurring in our institutions that will enable us to deliver on those outcomes. So I think this is a prime opportunity for any of you who are tuned in from an accrediting body or who have contacts at accrediting entities to ask them, what are they doing to ensure, because this is about sort of the continual double loop learning, right? We say something is important, but then how do we teach to it? And then how do we measure the outcome around it? It's the same way when we say, for a new faculty appointment, please submit a letter stating how you value diversity and how you've enacted equity in your work, but then we don't measure against it through their teaching or through their tenure review. There's a missed moment there. So, I honestly, I really do think, Norma, that your question is the answer unto itself, that accrediting bodies are in constant conversation with our institutions. And these are, of course, sometimes tense relationships, But in what ways do accrediting bodies move the ball forward? And in some ways, push our institutions in ways that our students push our institutions to do better, and then to be able to demonstrate those outcomes as evidence of that equity-minded work and platform, whether it's inside or outside the classroom. And I see that Stephanie just said that the Northwest Commission is doing a nice job with this. Thanks for that tip, Stephanie.
Thank you, Sumi. So you and I met a few years ago at the Tides Institute in Georgetown, which is teaching to increase diversity and equity in STEM. And so some of your work has been coaching faculty in specific equity-minded work that has been connected to a discipline or a program. One of the questions that came in earlier is, how do institutions begin to design equity across the institution or the campuses and not just specific to a particular program? And the question was, should this be done by a committee or with someone at the helm? But how do you really infuse equity across an institution?
Outstanding. I think this is one of the most important places for shared governance to be completely involved in this decision, because you're absolutely right. I have, as do you, those of you tuning in today, reams of stories of how folks who want to advance DEI missions on campuses end up often doing it in pockets and silos, because we first, and I've been a chief diversity officer, you first go with, who's willing to do the work with you most and most quickly. But in ideal circumstances, to have this be part of a shared governance framework in which faculty, staff, boards of trustees, various governing bodies are all invested in a larger framework, because then you have the most positive form of trickle down, right? Because you actually have a shared understanding of what equity, diversity, and inclusion actually mean for the campus that is very cogently tied to the mission of a particular institution. Everything can and should flow from that. If there's a shared understanding, that means you can also develop some shared sets of outcomes. What does it mean for faculty to be able to teach increasingly diverse learners and to come out on the other side with outcomes that demonstrate that not only are all learners learning at the most effective and agile of their capacities, but any prior gap that existed, opportunity gaps that existed, have not just been closed, but here's the best part. This is one of the data points we know, right, folks, that when we use universal design and learning principles, which is, I think, deeply tied to an equity-minded teaching and learning framework, that we almost immediately, even through just using active learning principles, see a disproportionate bump for first-gen students, students of color, women students, that all students, in fact, learn better, but that there's a disproportionately positive impact on minoritized and marginalized students. We can see those wins, and we should be able to do that in every column, in every silo of the institution. But to have it be both bottom up and top down from a shared governance model, and as a colleague said earlier, Norma said earlier, also encouraged through the accrediting process, right? Where's the evidence, is really powerful. Similarly in student affairs, similarly across all aspects of the campus. And that's in everything from hiring more mental health counselors, particularly those who are well-versed in serving communities of color and first-gen communities, who they themselves may not be people of color, but are actually skilled in that. There's so many different places to embed this across the institution. That would be the ideal way to do it. Now, we can have a whole set of conversations about how the ideal doesn't always happen, but that, for me, if you said, how would we actually do this across the board? Ensuring that faculty and other leadership governance structures are involved from the get, and including your boards of trustees, is a really powerful way to go. I can tell you that with my work with the President's Cabinet and the Board of Trustees at Harvey-Mudd College, that we shifted things quite quickly because we were able to develop a critical mass of both understanding as well as consensus about a movement forward and the needs, what was embedded within those needs in order to push some needles forward on the curricular and the co-curricular end. Great question.
Thank you, Sumi. So this is going to be your last question. You are going to be supporting Achieving the Dream in our network colleges and our Racial Equity Leadership Academy opportunity, which will be available to ATD institutions, and we will be releasing the applications in the fall, and they'll be due in November, and the institute is planned for the summer of 2021. So one of the questions that came in is, are there programs or schools that you have seen with high quality professional development programs focused on creating faculty and student affairs staff body that interpret and read data available in equitable ways? And I give you this question in the context of the Racial Equity Academy because part of the time there will be spent with you and Jade and others working on a project that might benefit an institution in terms of their ways in which they want to address racial equity.
Yeah, wonderful. As Monica's kind introduction at the top, she mentioned that one of the programs I direct is the USC Equity Institutes, which is a multi-week learning program for institutional leaders and other key decision makers, faculty, staff, administrators at college campuses all across the country. In our 2 years since developing this program, we worked with 28 institutions, 560 institutional leaders. And of course, we also do in-person engagements like we're going to be doing the Racial Equity Leadership Academy with ATD next summer. And one of the core elements of this program, whether it's live in person or whether it is through the virtual synchronous learning platform, are two, well, let's say three things. One is the opportunity for self-reflection to figure out what gaps and biases we ourselves hold before attempting to even do the work. And that is really critical for every single one of us, no matter our backgrounds, no matter if you identify as a queer Black woman, no matter if you identify as a brown mom of two. Every single one of us has something that we're bringing to the table that creates blind spots around the way we approach this work in really wrestling with equity on our campuses. Number one. Number two, another core aspect of the program is that we actually have concrete learning that's developed around examining data, using different tools to actually pull data apart, and those are both local and national tools, teaching folks how to develop asset-minded lenses around that data, and then developing structures and programs that involve climate assessment, that involve questioning what's happening in the environment to actually better understand and then leverage that data. So that's a big part of the work that comes out of our program. And the third piece, which Monica of course mentioned, are the projects, the racial equity projects, which are probably one of the highlights of our program, because we of course believe very much in consciousness raising and building those skills and tools, but it has to be transferred to action. So taking all the things that we're going to be doing in the Racial Equity Leadership Academy together, part of that will be, for those of you who end up participating, having the time and space to develop a specific project that you will leave with after the Institute, that you will leave at least with the framework of, so that you're ready to head back to your individual campus and begin the process of further developing and then implementing that project, particularly around data, around disaggregated data, around climate, whatever it might be. So the project work is critical. We can all say the nice words. Every single one of us can sit around and be like, yes, that's heteropatriarchy. And then what are you going to do about it? Right? This is always the question. What are you going to do about it? And that's a big function of the work that we're going to be doing together, is how do you develop the skills and the actual project pieces to take it back to your campus.
Thank you so much, Sumi. We really appreciate your spending time with us today. And we know that you have some other commitments, but we look forward to remaining connected with you and with the USC Racial Center. And we are really looking forward to the Academy next summer. So thank you, Sumi.
Folks, thank you so much again for allowing me to be in this space with you today. I'm looking forward to future conversations. I'm very easy to find if you'd like to follow up. Pendakur@usc.edu. And thank you, Monica, Fran, Karen, all of the entire ATD staff and network. Take good care, everybody.
Take care, Sumi. Next, we will hear from Susan Mayer, ATD's Chief Learning Officer, and Jonathan Unzini, ATD's Director of Teaching and Learning, who will set the stage for how ATD can continue to partner with you to advance your equitable outcomes and your student success work on your campuses. Thank you, John and Susan.
Thank you, Monica, and thanks for the opportunity to connect with everyone today. We appreciate your engagement, your presence with us on this Friday, and I'm excited to share a bit. As you know, I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Achieving the Dream, and I collaborate quite a bit with my colleagues across the organization. One of the ways we've done that in service of your work across the network this spring has been through our series of webinars on online teaching and learning through disruption. And I scrolled through the names in the chat through the session. I know many of you joined us on some of those sessions on engagement strategies, on innovative approaches to content delivery and assessment of student learning. We had a great session at the end of that series where folks shared their stories of accomplishment and resilience and student success across the network. We saw really great examples from network colleges, not just of rapidly equipping faculty to teach in a remote environment under really difficult circumstances, but also colleges modeling really effective ways of collaborating. Centers for Teaching and Learning, instructional designers, coming together with librarians and instructional technologists and advisors to help full-time faculty and adjunct faculty be well-equipped to do this work, and again, to do it under really difficult circumstances. We saw faculty who had significant experience teaching online before this crisis coming to the aid of their less experienced colleagues and serving as faculty champions, faculty peer coaches and mentors. And we see that colleges are planning to continue that kind of work through the summer with faculty who have more experience and more comfort teaching online, supporting their colleagues now to dig deep into their courses, to do some redesign work, to learn more about effective practices in online pedagogy. As I said, we carried through that series of 4 webinars in March and April. The recordings and the PowerPoint slides from those webinars are available for download and for sharing on the Achieving the Dream website. And we anticipate providing more resources like that and to continue to add to that resource page as we move through the summer. But what we also saw quite clearly is that this is ultimately not just about the mechanics of teaching in an online course, transitioning a face-to-face course to an online environment. It's about colleagues from across a college, full-time faculty, adjunct faculty, advisors, counselors, student affairs professionals in all kinds of roles, librarians, instructional technologists, and all administrators who serve in a variety of roles coming together to figure out how to keep students engaged and how to keep them connected with their identities as learners through what they are experiencing right now, an unprecedented time. And understandably, they're trying to attend to many other issues of crisis in their lives. So how do they remain connected in their education? How do they continue to move towards a successful outcome? So we're seeing really wonderful models of collaboration at the level of the folks who engage directly with students, but we're also seeing college leaders come to understand that they need to do their student success work in a way that is more blended, that doesn't think just about teaching and learning or just about holistic student supports or just about attending to issues of data, but rather bringing these areas of work together in an approach that's more blended, engaging the supports of coaching, which Susan will speak to more in a moment, from all across ATD, and also engaging with the resources that we are continuing to create for you. Susan's going to talk in a moment about some webinars and some new resources we're releasing in the next couple of weeks. We also have a brand new teaching and learning toolkit, which we've been working on for several months. We were working on it before this crisis, but we see that it has even more resonance now, and we want to help colleges to keep their eye on the ball. So that resource will be released in June, and we expect to offer some webinars to accompany the release of that resource to help you begin to engage with it. What I really want to emphasize is the admiration I have for colleges. What I am seeing is, in this moment, you would understand how faculty and others would say, I need to figure out what's right in front of me. I need to figure out the nuts and bolts of this online course so that this doesn't unravel for me and my students. And what I'm actually seeing happening is that people are not taking their eye off the ball about being equity-minded in their approach to their pedagogy. I think it would be easy to say, I just need to do what is right in front of me today and tomorrow to keep surviving. And I think people are understanding they can't take their eye off of being an equity-minded professional, equity-minded faculty member, equity-minded advisor, equity-minded counselor, whatever their role is at the college. So I have deep gratitude for how people are continuing to push their student success work forward and to bring an equity-minded approach to whatever their role is at their college. Susan?
Thanks, John, for that setup. We've also been able to learn from our colleges about how they're using data to support their decision-making in these times of disruption, and how we can support them to make evidence-based decisions about the ongoing improvements in instructional and student supports that John just talked about. For example, most colleges collected a lot of engagement data from their learning management systems, and they used this effectively to reach out to students who were dropping out of a course or who were at risk of not completing a course. But now that the semester is ending, colleges are collecting outcomes data on course completions and grades. And we all need to understand what the impact has been of virtual instruction and virtual student supports, not only on these outcome metrics, but also on student learning. And we need to learn about this from the students, because as we know, designing for students and keeping equity at the forefront requires the inclusion of the student voice. So by collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, we can answer questions such as what policies need to be changed? What processes need to be redesigned? What does the data suggest for investments in professional development or technology? And what resources need to be allocated strategically to keep the momentum going for equitable student success? So as John mentioned, in response to these needs, we've created 2 resources for our network colleges. First, a data-informed decision-making guide in times of disruption, and second, a COVID reflection. The first of these, the Data-Informed Decision Guide, will be introduced during a webinar next Tuesday, May 19th. It helps colleges identify key questions to ask, metrics to measure, and stakeholders to involve in the discussion about what the data says, so that we are doing what SUNY challenged us to do, which is to tell equity-minded stories. It also provides a methodology that we can use to apply the learning to policy, process, and resource allocation decisions. The second tool, which is the COVID reflection, enables colleges to document what they did differently, what they learned, and what they're going to apply, how they're going to apply this moving forward. What did we do differently that worked really well? And how can we celebrate those successes? What did we learn about what we can leave behind? And where did we identify some opportunities to do things even more effectively, to take friction out of the system, or to reimagine how we're going to work going forward? Both of these resources will be supported by ATD's coaches. Like you, we've had to make a transition to the virtual environment very rapidly also. And so to support our coaches, we're providing an ongoing curriculum of professional development that includes both technology and pedagogy, to enable our coaches to support you as effectively in a virtual setting as they do in a face-to-face environment. One big success that we've had recently is transitioning our institutional capacity cafes, which many of you have done very recently, to a Zoom-based environment with breakout rooms for the small group discussions. More than 300 faculty and staff at multiple colleges have participated now, and the response data indicates that participants overwhelmingly found these discussions to be really valuable. And so based on that learning, we plan to build out this model for additional coaching support for applications such as the COVID reflection discussions, or scenario planning discussions, or data summits. We'll also be providing support for student support redesign, virtual student focus groups, and evaluation and assessment planning, working collaboratively across our multiple areas within ATD. And speaking of data summits, we're planning to host many of our learning events in a virtual environment this summer and this fall, starting with the Gateway to College Peer Learning Conference in July. The Data and Analytics Summit will take place in October virtually, and will focus on building capacity in data and technology like it always does, but with special emphasis on capacity building for disruptive times. We reached out to you, our network colleagues, for help to help us design the agenda that's responsive to what are the most relevant topics and issues you face today. So John and I collectively want to reinforce our commitment and support of you through coaching, opportunities for best practice sharing, and tools and resources. Thank you.
Thank you, John and Susan. Next, we will hear from 2 of our ATD expert coaches and practitioners in the field who will share examples of effective outreach and retention strategies. First, we will hear from Vicki Locke, our ATD leadership coach and Dean of Student Success at Northeast Wisconsin Technical College and ATD Leader College. Following Vicki, we will hear from Dr. Mark Figueroa, ATD Data and Leadership Coach and Associate Provost for Institutional Research and Planning and Assistant Professor of Education at Lewis and Clark College. Vicki?
Good afternoon. It's afternoon here anyway. I think it's afternoon for most of us. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. I think I have a slide that will show a little bit about Northeast Wisconsin Technical College, just to give you some context about who we are and where we are in Northeast Wisconsin. One of the things I do want to point out on here is that we want to acknowledge the land that our college is on was originally belonged to the Menominee tribe of Indians and is now Oneida tribe land, and our campus actually sits on that land. So one of the things that is important about that is that we have in Wisconsin still a very strong, vibrant Native population, and that's part of the group of students that we serve. So everyone doesn't have that, I know, across the nation, but it does make us unique in that way. So I've been thinking a lot. One of the roles I play at the college is the lead for our core team. And we've been thinking a lot about how this rapid transition to what we call flexible didn't all go online. Some of it went into various forms of flexible learning after our spring break in March. How as a college we were doing, how are our staff doing, and how are our students doing? So last week we took the opportunity to meet virtually with our core team, and we invited a panel of faculty and a panel of student services folks to share sort of what they were hearing from students and what they were experiencing. And so what I'm really going to do today is just give you a quick summary of what we learned and what that has led me sort of to start thinking more about. So overwhelmingly, the faculty and the student services folks said they're tired. They're tired. They're tired that WebEx, virtual, flexible learning is very exhausting for the faculty especially, but also for the students. Anxiety is super high among our student population. Anxiety about a lot of things. Some of it's contextual, right? What's going on in our country, what's going on in our state, what's going on in our community. And then how they are now suddenly responsible for caring for their children, worrying about their parents, being isolated and maybe in a home that's not necessarily safe. So we talked a lot about that, but then we also talked about what were we doing to help our students. And overwhelmingly, flexibility in meeting course assignment deadlines just kept coming up. So some faculty who maybe in the past were not as open to allowing students to turn in work late or to take an extra couple days, altering assignments, had to alter the way that they did assessments. We're reaching out to students and saying, hey, if you can't make this deadline, let me know what's going on and I will work with you. Lots and lots of personal outreach through WebEx, phone, Skype, text. Students are responding pretty well to those. We've had a major uptick in the number of referrals. We use our Starfish system to refer to services at our college, especially to our Student Emergency Fund. So making sure that students' basic needs are cared for. One of the things I think that I found really revealing and maybe something I don't do as well as I could is to really share some personal stories and spaces. We heard that today, and it was really, I think it's really important when you're talking to a student to share that, hey, we're all experiencing this level of anxiety. We're all trying to work our way through this, and it's totally normal to feel that way. Listening to our students, really listening to our students and reaching out to our students. So one of our support specialists shared, she works primarily with our childcare program, that she's giving her students a call to see how they're doing, see if they need more support. And one of the things that she shared was that many of them are single parents, and just having an adult to talk to has been like a tremendous relief for them. So never underestimate the power of just a reach out from someone who cares, just to check in and see how they're doing. It wasn't necessarily because they were asking for help, it was because we were checking in to see how they were doing. And really important to help our students advocate for themselves with faculty. So a couple of other things that we did, we heard a lot about this as well from faculty and from staff. We repurposed computers. I know many colleges have done this. Laptops and hotspots for our students that did not have access to check out across our district. So you can see our district's pretty large and some of it's very rural. And when we disaggregated that data, one of the things that didn't surprise us was that it was overwhelmingly students of color that needed those laptops. So they were about 20% of our enrollment, but they're about 40% of our actual students who needed a laptop or hotspot. And then we thought that probably the access to internet in the rural areas was where we would see the biggest impact. And what we actually saw was that the majority of our students who needed access through a hotspot live in Brown County, which has pretty good internet connections, but so it's really not a matter of whether or not the connection was there, it's really a matter of whether or not they could afford it. So really thinking about what is the socioeconomic impact. And then the last thing I just want to mention, because the remarks earlier today just really brought this home for us. We had a WebEx with our president and ELT meeting for our students. I would highly recommend it if you haven't done that. Many of our students joined who might not ever show up in person. And they really were sharing some of the impact of the COVID crisis on them and what they were feeling in the community. So really looking, we have a very large Hmong Asian community in our community. So really the hatred, the violence, there have been some incidents in our community that were not, directed to that, against that population. So really acknowledging that, listening to them, and then our president really reaching out and saying, and supporting all of our students, and then looking for programming and opportunities to put virtual place at the tables in place to listen to our students and give them a voice and give them an opportunity to share their experiences. So that's what I have, and I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Mark.
So greetings and thank you all. Good morning to some of us and good afternoon to the rest of you. I'm going to try to frame my comments more around sort of a mindset and reminders, because obviously my colleagues have touched on a lot of the things that that I wanted to say. I think part of that is a reminder or reference that a lot of us are learning a lot of the same things, and the importance of sharing what we've learned in these forums help create that opportunity. So the first thing I want to acknowledge is for a long time, we've used the mantra in higher education that we move at a glacial pace. That if you think about the amount of governance and the way decision-making normally occurs in higher education, there's no way people could have fathomed that within 2 weeks' time we would have been fully online and be operating in this environment for, now 2+ months for some of us. But yet we've done it. So I think the excuse that, oh, we can't do that or that's not possible, well, it certainly is, because we've done things that we know are impossible. Because if I would have asked you in January, do you think we could flip the college online in 2 weeks? People would have laughed and said impossible, but now we're here. So some of the things I'd like to talk about is, this notion of context and understanding that, our students, they're nervous, they're scared, they're anxious, and a lot of that has to do with their inability to be able to plan for the future. And I think what this has done for a number of us, speaking about the notion of lenses and equity, this has really helped clean lenses for a lot of us. Many of us have, we sit in places of extreme privilege, and we have, resources and backing and support, both financially and otherwise. And I think what this has done is it's sent a shock to a lot of people. And some people who had been very comfortable now realize what it means to have inequity. And I think that has also allowed for a creation of what I'm seeing is a much more empathetic population of community members on our campuses, people that are starting to understand what it means to not have in a time where they maybe have always had. So maintaining that level of empathy and understanding that we're all being impacted in very different ways. Some of the things I think that are important is to remind students that you are thinking about them and that you're there. Let them know how to contact you. A lot of the things that we sort of take for granted, sort of like, oh, get online and you can find it out, won't necessarily work for a lot of students. So we're reminding them how to contact you. Communicate in their preferred modality when possible. Leverage social media. I know some of my schools that I work with, particularly my travel colleges that are in more remote areas, have really relied on social media and Facebook in particular to be the conduit to send out communications. Some of the presidents and other folks have done YouTube videos and use those as a means of communication, and also leverage some of the local, local cable and radio to provide information and do outreach. I think what I can say is to keep it real. I think a lot of people have talked about that before, letting our students know that we're in this very similar situation and being frank and not over-promising. I think we've heard a lot of rhetoric, both at the local and national level about promises, and I think that's some of the things that we need to be very mindful of. Though we know we want to help and do the best we can't do everything for everybody. So know our limitations and communicate those appropriately. The other thing too is think about the way that we ask the question. So for example, we tend to say, well, why can't students just, and then fill in the blank? Can we flip that questioning to start asking what can they do and what are they able to do? So much more of a strengths-based approach, as we mentioned earlier. And for leadership to acknowledge that these are tough times, right? And let's just be frank that there is no playbook for this. None of us have ever gone through this before. And so part of this is we're learning as we're going and being able to maintain that flexibility and understanding that sometimes we may get it wrong, sometimes our students may get it wrong, but not to be sort of in the mode of wanting to go into punish, but to have that level of sort of empathy and care. In terms of planning, I think this is an opportune time for us to plan with the students of ours who are most in need, because that will also force us to help to reconfigure and rethink the way that we deliver our services and programs, because now maybe we understand in a much better way what it means to be without or to have to struggle and balance with things that maybe we haven't before. I think it's really important for the board to be engaged as well and keep the board apprised and also let them know what you're doing. I know at my home institution, we spend a fair amount of time talking to our board and letting them know that we're on it, we got it, we're working on it, and to keep them informed so that you try to avoid as much as you can some of the politicking and sort of name blaming that's going to go on. As best as you can, put all of your students on your radar and find ways to communicate and outreach to each student and to maintain that level of sort of energy until you have all of your students accounted for. I know in some of my smaller institutions, it's been easier for them to do that. And they literally have been able to track down every single student, I think with the exception of 2 that were enrolled in this most current term, just to find out how they were doing and to let them know that the school is available and also how they can re-engage. I think we need to force ourselves to be able to think about what we need to do differently when we come back, whatever that looks like, in hybrid form, online, back in person, so that these issues that students are facing now are things that we keep on our radar at all costs. There are basic needs that are going to need to be met. Some of the schools I know have been working with, developing their own food pantries and connecting with communities. So the institutions may serve as that conduit and that liaison between the students and the communities, because we're already doing part of that now. This notion also too of this sort of all hands on deck and we're sort of all in this together. I think it's really important to acknowledge that disproportionate impact that this work is having on a lot of folks. I know some of our frontline staff are doing a disproportionate, again, amount of work trying to support our students. So make sure that folks are given an opportunity to sort of decompress and give them some time to rejuvenate. Because unfortunately, for those of you who are runners who have run before, especially distance runners, I think what happened is we were in a marathon, but we came out in full sprint. And so when you come out in full sprint, you lose that energy. So I think for us, we have to take that time to sort of recoup and regain that energy, because we're going to be in this for a while. And we want to make sure that all the folks who are involved in this endeavor are getting the support that they need as well. So in addition to our students, making sure that our staff and our faculty and our administrators are all caring for one another. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I know we have some questions coming up. So I'll pass it back over.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Vicki. And just a couple of remarks in following that up. I'm Shauna Davis, the Holistic Student Supports team here at ATD. Vicki, you started out by talking about our faculty and staff are tired. And I thought about that. Our faculty and staff are tired, our students are tired, our communities are tired. And it's really important when we stop and reflect on our names, being community colleges, that this is what's so probably unprecedented about this. This is such a community experience, a community impact. And so I think about that in terms of our rapid response. We started with a rapid response. As Mark mentioned, we started running a marathon at full sprint speed. And then we are moving into this place, and I think Susan Mayer touched on this earlier, where we need to look at what we are learning and the data, and we move from a rapid response to how do we improve the quality of our response. And then from there, as we're continuously learning, how do we do better at getting more proactive in our response? And then how do we ensure that we have a sustainable response? And so things such as Mark mentioning the community, colleges can't do it all, but remembering that essential and embedded in our name as being community colleges, that what we should have is an accurate read on the community resources and our ability to or if we have not mapped the community resources, and understanding where we can provide a holistic response in terms of information and contextualize to our students, as well as our faculty and staff. Let us not forget that this financial crisis, is also being felt by the people who are there to provide the instruction and to the support. And so to that end, we want to make sure that we are aware of our college community needs, as it's been pointed out so importantly by multiple speakers, and the disproportionate impact of that. But let us not forget that the people who are there to support also are experiencing financial crisis, and that we want to make sure that in order to keep them available and to keep them healthy and supported, in order to support our students to be there and to be engaged, we need to make sure that that is a community response. And the last thing I would say to that on being proactive, we've talked a lot about so far up here to the webinar, co-curricular supports and contextualizing. One of the things that I think we haven't talked a lot about in terms of college response and need is around the career and the economic piece, in terms of what is our response to that, right? So we've been focused on trying to enroll students. We have students who are graduating at this point who don't know necessarily where their economic opportunities might lie. We have faculty and staff who may be experiencing from our own economic challenges at our institutions, job loss, or perhaps they have partners or family members in their home who are also experiencing those financial implications. And we also certainly our students at all levels, whether it's traditionally aged students and what they're experiencing through their family unit, or whether it's the adult student who has also been impacted by that. So there is something where we can do more and think about, we don't need our students to tell us that they have lost employment or that they're suffering economic hardship. We should assume that that is the overwhelming experience, and start to really mobilize around that comprehensive resources and supports for how do you get back into the workforce? What are other ways you can use your skills? In addition to all of the wonderful efforts that have been made around emergency student aid and other types of resources to support food and housing insecurity. So those are just things that I think coming as we move into the long term and eventually start to turn some corner here, that as we can really think about from a student support standpoint, community standpoint, and economic development standpoint, how we can do an enhanced job of really looking at career services, supports, and the wraparound needs in a more integrated fashion. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Trent, and she's going to open us up for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shauna. So all of the panelists are going to join me, and we have a little less than 10 minutes for questions, and I'll be using the ones that you submitted in the registration. And we'll get started with you, Vicki. We know that community college students manage more than their educations, including work and caring for dependents. What additional challenges are these students facing in our current environment that we might not have considered?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I think the fact that they may have job loss. Many of our students work in those industries that were impacted, but also many of them work in essential industries. And so they may have actually had an increase in their work hours. And then the anxiety, of course, of working in healthcare. Many of them work in long-term healthcare, but they're working as CNAs as they're working through college. Very stressful situation for them. And then, of course, if they have family members that are impacted by the disease. So I think you add sort of that context of what else they're working through in the environment that's a little bit different. I do think that we're doing a great job of sharing what's going on with our students, with our faculty, and letting them know that for some students, this is the amount of juggling and stress that they are dealing with all the time. And so anything we put into place that helps students through this would be really helpful to maintain in order to help all of our students all be successful. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Vicki. It does. It does. Thank you. John, the next one's for you. You talked about teaching and learning considerably, and you do quite a bit to support our colleges in your work. But for students who lack foundational learning skills and knowledge, and given that we had to migrate to online learning pretty quickly, what are some strategies for supporting learning in the classroom for these students?
Thank you, Monica. I think in some ways, there are probably some core ways of approaching that question that should be consistent no matter what the modality is, that people, faculty, full-time and adjunct faculty who have embraced that way of thinking about supporting all of their students and bringing an equity-minded approach to their teaching should probably be bringing that same philosophy to their work now. It might look a little different in a remote or online environment. I want to point to a set of ideas that Dr. Wood and Dr. Harris presented in one of their webinars this spring. And I know our colleague Lori Flad posted a link to that series of webinars in the chat a little while ago. And we've also posted a link to it in our resources on the ATD website. But they talk about 5 equity-minded approaches for teaching online. And I think this is important for all students. It's important for students who may be underprepared, who may have certain barriers to success, depending on what the course is. But I think this is going to be helpful for creating the kind of community we want in any of our classrooms, whether they're face-to-face or online or hybrid. The first is to be intrusive, to actively track your students' progress towards learning and to identify when students are disengaging and to reach out proactively before it's too late. The second is to be relational, to make moves as an instructor that will likely foster relationships with your students. The third is to be culturally relevant and affirming. So you're designing an environment in your classroom, whether that's an online or a face-to-face classroom. You're designing an environment in which all of your students feel welcomed and included. There's great information in our resources about how you can do that right from the first day or the first week of class in terms of how you present a course syllabi, in terms of how you present class norms and co-create those with your students. The fourth idea is to be community focused, to require interaction through collaboration and discussion, but to do that in a way where you're not having students feel targeted or put on the spot. And the fifth principle is to be race conscious. And I think this is a nice thread to come through everything that we've heard on today's session. You're being intentional about providing opportunities to engage in racial and equity issues within the context of the course. There's more information about this on our resources. I think people are often surprised to find all the ways they can engage with these issues across all different academic disciplines.
Thank you, John. And I'd like to remind our attendees to please chat some of your suggestions while we are talking so that your colleagues can see them. The next question is for you, Mark. We understand that under-resourced students are more adversely impacted, especially in times of crises. What data can we collect to demonstrate the equity gap growth during this disruption? Or how might we look at our data differently?
Sure, I think one of the, some of the data discussion happened earlier, but this is a recent conversation I just had with one of my colleges. This term is going to have a big asterisk next to it, right? And I think what the tendency for some schools to do would be to just say, well, that's an asterisk year, it didn't really count, let's just sort of bypass it. And I would say that's a big mistake. I think what we need to do is to take a really deep look at what the way students progress through their courses in this particular term, being mindful particularly of when people withdrew, when people stopped out, what their grades were, because part of the challenge, and we know this, is particularly our students who are in their first year, if they are taking classes this term that they absolutely needed in order for them to get to their next step and they didn't do well, we've stalled their ability to progress through the pipeline. So I think it's imperative that the schools reach out to those students and say, hey, don't worry. We know some people may have got knocked off their path. They're going to have a stall, but here's how you re-engage, and we're going to make sure that you're back on track. So I think that's probably the most important thing we can do in terms of taking a look at our most recent data, looking at those students that we know may have got that big hiccup right now, and reach out to them and let them know we got you and we're going to get you back to where you need to go. So I'd say that's probably the best thing we can do right now and most immediately, because we can deal with it today, not 10 years from now.
Thank you, Mark. Susan, the next one is for you. We know that many of our colleges are involved in pathways work, and they're ensuring that their students are thoughtful about the courses they select. How do we address equity in pathways planning processes given what's happening now? Susan, you're on mute.
Thank you. Pathways is based on the principle that students have a clear path towards earning a credential that has labor market value that allows them to have social and economic mobility. So one of the things that Shauna mentioned a couple minutes ago was the importance of having career exploration and career assessment work early in a student's journey. So in Pathways, and what we see in successful colleges that are using the Pathways framework is their students have an opportunity to explore careers that they may not known about, careers that have life-sustaining wages or family-sustaining wages, and that they are then guided with not only clear core sequences, but co-curricular and extracurricular supports, experiential learning opportunities, internships, research opportunities, to be able to distinguish themselves to get those jobs that have high labor market value.
Thank you, Susan. And Shauna, the last question is for you, and you have a little less than a minute to give us some wisdom. You speak often about the importance of holistic student support, which is deeply rooted in equity. How can colleges more overtly integrate equity into their HSS work, especially in our current environment?
I think I'm going to say we need to take a hard look at policy. We talk a lot about equity. We will talk a lot about welcoming and making students feel empowered. We'll do that. But sometimes we stop short at looking at some of those institutional, academic, financial policies that we have on our campuses. Many of our institutions right now are grappling with, they may have had some sort of placement is an equity issue. It is very much rooted in terms of progression. It's rooted in terms of your advising sequence. It's rooted in terms of what you can take and things that reach financial implications. If you're using Title IV funding, all kinds of things that you could start to do a spider web out and map out and say what's the impact of that. So I do think we need to look at structures with processes, but we need to look at our policies at our institution and be willing to not only change a practice, but address the policy in writing, in full form, to ensure that there are equitable policies.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thank you to all the panelists. Dr. Stout, will you please share some closing remarks and let us know what's coming up with ATD?
Absolutely. Thanks, Monica. What a terrific team that we have at Achieving the Dream. One thing I will say to you is you are not alone in this journey, and we are side by side learning with you and trying to get you resources and materials along the way that we curate from what we're learning just in time. So we will have some upcoming opportunities for the network to continue to engage. I think we'll put up an ending slide as I do my closing comments. In addition to not being alone, there are no silos in a crisis. And that's one of the things that I'm learning as I watch the work of our colleges and all the inspiring work you're doing. Silos that existed pre-COVID have been broken apart. And as leaders, we have a responsibility to ensure that those silos remain broken apart and that we do come together, student affairs, academic affairs, all parts of our organizations to support student success in an equitable way. There are a couple of things that really resonated with me today, and in no particular order. The comment about accreditation was striking, and one that really resonated with me because I've worked all of my career in the Middle States region, and I keynoted their December event and challenged them to take on an equity agenda. The word equity is nowhere in the Middle States standards. So the example that was given in the chat about the Northwest Commission is a really good example of an accreditation body that is more forward thinking. And I think that's very important for our progress. The second thing that struck me was early on when we were talking about disaggregation of student data and this new need to really understand the intersectionality of our students. So we have students that as you can't look at siloed disaggregated data, you have to look at cross data. Our students take on many of the demographic components that we study. Another thing that hit me was the idea of self-care, and we all need to practice that. And the last thing I want to reflect on was Mark's analogy of the marathon. I've been doing a lot of work with Achieving the Dream over the last 5 years, and we've been patient with change and institutional transformation on our campuses. And we often say that leaders need to have urgency and patience at the same time to do this work. I think COVID has changed that framing in my mind to one where as leaders, we need to have urgency and pace. And that means that understanding that this is a marathon, but maybe not having as much patience as we did pre-COVID is the place that we need to move into as leaders in our organizations. And I think from what I've seen on our campuses and the response of faculty and other professionals and staff on our campuses, our colleges are ready. They see their need now more clearly than ever that we are leaving students behind and that's just not acceptable. So we do have some upcoming events that I hope you'll join in with us around the data-informed decision-making, building adaptive capacity for resiliency and agility. We really believe that our 7 fundamentals are also fundamentals that help you build agility. We are launching our Gateway to College Peer Learning Conference. Will be virtual in July. And then we'll be looking at virtual experiences for our Data and Analytics Summit and some deeper work around our holistic student support range of activities. So please continue to tune in. We look at the chat, we look at your questions, and we continue to learn from you. Thank you so much and have a great weekend.